The wind in Black Creek, Montana didn't just whistle. It howled with the voices of ghosts and warnings. For Hannah Miller, 7 months a widow and 8 months with child, it was the sound of every fear she had. Her husband's fence, her only line of defense against the vast, hungry wilderness, was splintered and broken. Then a silhouette appeared against the bruised twilight, a drifter, with eyes that held the dust of 1,000 lonely miles. Was he the answer to a desperate prayer, or was he just the first gust of the real storm to come? This is the story of how a broken fence tested the boundaries of trust, and how one storm washed away the past and revealed the true nature of family. The year was 1888. The Montana sky was a vast, unforgiving canvas of pearl gray, stretched taut from the jagged peaks of the Crazies to the rolling plains that bled into the horizon. For Hannah Miller, that sky was a clock, and its hands were moving too fast. Each gust of wind that rattled the glass of her small cabin window felt like a judgment. It was a late autumn wind carrying the sharp metallic scent of coming snow and the deeper, more unsettling scent of trouble. Her trouble had a name: Silas Croft. His Bar C ranch sprawled across the valley like a greedy king, and his cattle were as relentless as their owner. They didn't just graze, they conquered. Since her husband Thomas had died in a freak logging accident that spring, the fence line they had built together had become a symbol of her crumbling world. A section of it, nearly 50 yards long on the western edge bordering Black Creek, had been trampled and broken. Croft's longhorns, smelling the water, pushed through with impunity, churning her small pasture into a muddy ruin. Hannah stood on her porch, one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other holding a heavy wool shawl tight against the cold. The swell of her belly was a constant heavy reminder of the future she was fighting for, and the man she had lost. Thomas had been a good man, a strong man. He would have fixed that fence in a single afternoon, his axe and post-hole digger moving with a familiar, comforting rhythm. But Thomas was gone, and the rhythm of her life was now just the frantic, unsteady beat of her own heart. She had tried. Lord, how she had tried. For 2 days she'd hauled new posts from the small copse of pine on her land, her muscles screaming in protest, the baby shifting uncomfortably with every lift and strain. But the ground was hard, almost frozen, and her strength was finite. The half-dug holes and leaning posts were a testament to her failure. That's when she saw him. He wasn't much more than a silhouette at first, walking along the dusty track that passed for a road. He didn't ride a horse, which was unusual. A man on foot in this country was either destitute or dangerous, and often both. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace that wasn't a saunter. It was the walk of a man who had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world to get there, a man for whom walking was as natural as breathing. As he drew closer, details emerged from the twilight. He wore a dusty, worn-out duster that had once been brown scuffed boots and a hat with a brim that sagged with the memory of 100 rains. His face was all angles and shadow, covered in a week's worth of dark stubble. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startling pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and they seemed to be taking in everything: the broken fence, the struggling farm, and her standing alone on the porch. He stopped at the edge of her property, his gaze fixed on the ruined fence line. He didn't look at her directly, but she felt his awareness of her like a physical presence. She tightened her grip on the shawl, her knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at her to go inside, bar the door, and grab the shotgun, Thomas had kept over the mantel. Men like this were spectres of the West, drifting from one tragedy to the next, sometimes causing them, sometimes just bearing witness. He finally turned his head, his pale eyes meeting hers across the 50 yards of dead grass and cold air. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was rough like stones grinding together, but it wasn't unkind. "Can I help you?" Hannah called back, her own voice tighter than she'd intended. He took a few steps forward, stopping at the first broken post. He nudged it with the toe of his boot. It wobbled pathetically in its shallow hole. "Looks like you could use a hand," he stated, not asked. "I'm managing." She lied the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. He looked from the fence to the sky, sniffing the air. "Storm's coming. A bad one. Those cattle will be in your cabin by morning if this fence ain't patched." He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm good with my hands. I don't work for free, but I work fair. A hot meal and a place in your barn for a few nights. That's my price." Her heart hammered against her ribs. The barn. Letting a complete stranger sleep just yards from her door. A man with no name, no horse, no past that he was willing to share. It was madness. But then she looked at the splintered posts, at the dark, churning clouds, and felt the kick of her unborn child. The thought of Croft's cattle trampling what little she had left, or worse, one of them goring her in the dark, was a more immediate and tangible terror. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. He hesitated for a moment, as if the name was a coat he was reluctant to put on. "Thaddeus," he finally said. "Thaddeus Kane." The name meant nothing to her, but it sounded solid, biblical. She made a decision born of pure desperation. "The barn is cold," she said, "but it's dry. There's a stew on the stove. You fix that fence before the first snow flies, and the meal and the barn are yours." "Done," he said, and with another nod he dropped a small battered satchel by the roadside and walked toward the woodpile where her tools lay abandoned. He picked up the axe, testing its weight, his movements economical and sure. He was a man who knew his way around work. As Thaddeus Kane set to his task, the rhythm of his axe striking wood echoing in the twilight, Hannah felt a sliver of hope. But it was a fragile thing, overshadowed by a deep and gnawing unease. She had just invited the wilderness onto her land to save her from it. And as the first icy flakes of snow began to drift down from the darkening sky, she prayed to God she hadn't just traded one disaster for another. Thaddeus worked with a silent, ferocious efficiency that was both mesmerizing and unnerving. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving a bruised purple twilight that was quickly being consumed by a thick curtain of snow. Hannah lit a lantern and hung it on a post near where he worked, the small pool of golden light, a fragile bastion against the encroaching dark. She watched from the porch the shotgun, now resting across her lap. He didn't just fix the fence, he remade it. He pulled her inadequate posts from their shallow holes with a grunt of effort, tossing them aside like kindling. He dug new holes deep and true, his shovel slicing into the hard-packed earth with a force she couldn't have mustered in a week. Each post was set with an almost reverential precision, tamped down until it was as solid as a mountain stone. He worked without pause, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The only sounds, the scrape of his shovel, the thud of the post driver, and the relentless howl of the wind. When the stew was ready, she called out to him. "Mr. Kane, food's hot." He finished setting one last post before acknowledging her wiping a sleeve across his brow. He walked to the porch, stopping at the bottom step, careful not to cross the threshold into her space. He took the offered bowl and tin cup of coffee, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. The contact sent a jolt through her, a startling warmth against the cold. "My thanks, ma'am," he said, retreating to the relative dryness under the porch eaves to eat. He ate like he worked, quickly, silently, without fuss. "My husband, Thomas, he built this place," she found herself saying, the words tumbling out to fill the silence. "He said a good fence is a good neighbor. Seems our neighbor doesn't agree." Thaddeus looked up from his bowl, his pale eyes catching the lantern light. "Some men don't want neighbors. They just want the land." He gestured with his spoon toward the darkness where the bar sea lay. A man like Silas Croft, he sees a fence as a challenge, not a boundary, especially when it belongs to a widow. The directness of his words startled her. He had summed up her entire struggle in a single sentence. "You know him. I know the type." Thaddeus corrected, his gaze dropping back to his food. "Big hat, big herd, small soul. They're all cut from the same cloth." Before she could press him further, a new sound cut through the storm, the rhythmic beat of hooves, steady and strong. 2 riders emerged from the swirling snow, their forms dark and iffiting. One was a hulking man with a thick beard, a man she recognized as Croft's foreman, Abe. The other was Silas Croft himself. Croft was a man whose physical presence was an extension of his will. He sat tall in his expensive saddle, his face framed by a neatly trimmed silver beard set in a mask of stern authority. He reined in his horse just outside the lantern's glow, his eyes sweeping over the scene with undisguised contempt. "Evening, Hannah," Croft said, his voice, a smooth, oily baritone that failed to conceal its underlying menace. "Having some trouble." His gaze flickered to the new sturdy posts, then settled on Thaddeus. "And who might this be? Finally hired some help. Have you?" "This is Mr. Kane," Hannah said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. "He's helping me with the fence your cattle destroyed." Croft let out a low chuckle. "My cattle go where the grazing is good, Hannah. It's the law of nature. A stronger fence might have taught them otherwise." He leaned forward, his gloved hands resting on his saddle horn. His eyes, small and dark like a boar's, narrowed on Thaddeus. "I haven't seen you around here, Kane. Where you from?" Thaddeus rose slowly to his feet, placing the empty bowl on the porch step. He wasn't as tall as Croft's foreman, but he possessed a stillness, a coiled energy that made him seem more dangerous. "Here and there," he answered, his voice flat. "Here and there," Croft mocked. "The answer of a man with something to hide. I don't like vagrants on my valley floor, Kane. They bring trouble. I suggest you finish your meal, collect whatever paltry sum she's paying you, and be on your way." "He's not a vagrant," Hannah interjected, finding her courage. "He's a worker, and he's staying until the job is done. The barn is his for the night." Silas Croft's smile vanished. "The barn. You'd let a drifter sleep in your barn, Hannah. A lone woman in your condition. Thomas would turn in his grave." He swung his gaze back to Thaddeus, a clear threat in his eyes. "You hear me, boy? This is my valley. I see your face again after sunrise, and I'll have Abe here escort you out. He's not as polite as I am." Abe the foreman grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. Thaddeus didn't flinch. He simply looked at Croft, his pale eyes as cold as the snow. "The lady offered me a deal. I aim to see it through. The fence will be done by morning." The sheer audacity of the drifter's defiance seemed to momentarily stun Croft. He stared at Thaddeus, then at Hannah, a flicker of something new in his eyes, not just contempt, but calculation. He seemed to be reassessing the situation. "Have it your way," Croft sneered, pulling on his reins. "But don't say I didn't warn you, both of you." With a final lingering glare, he and his foreman turned their horses and were swallowed by the storm. The silence they left behind was heavier than before, thick with unspoken stern threats. The snow was falling faster now, a thick, blinding sheet of white. "You should go inside, ma'am," Thaddeus said softly, his back still to her, as he looked out into the darkness where Croft had disappeared. "It's getting colder." "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "Challenged him. He's a powerful man, Mr. Kane." "He's a bully," Thaddeus countered, turning to face her. The lantern light carved deep shadows into his face. "And bullies only understand one thing. Push back." He picked up the axe. "I've got a fence to finish." Hannah retreated into the warmth of her cabin, but the chill she felt had nothing to do with the weather. She had seen the look in Silas Croft's eyes. He wasn't just annoyed. He was insulted. A drifter and a widow had defied him. In his world, that was a debt that would have to be collected. And she had seen something else, too. In the moment Thaddeus had faced down Croft, she'd seen more than just a drifter. She'd seen a man who was no stranger to confrontation, a man who knew how to stand his ground. It was reassuring, but it was also terrifying, because men who learned to stand their ground like that often learned it in places where backing down meant dying. She barred the door, the heavy wooden beam sliding into place with a solid thud. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the real danger wasn't the storm raging outside. It was the one that Silas Croft had just promised to bring. And her only ally was a man she'd known for less than 3 hours, a man with secrets in his winter sky eyes. The storm hit with the fury of a biblical plague. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding wall of white. The world beyond Hannah's windows ceased to exist, erased by the blizzard. The temperature plummeted. Any thought of Thaddeus sleeping in the barn was a bud. It would be a death sentence. After another hour during which the sound of his work somehow impossibly continued, Hannah knew she couldn't leave him out there. Her humanity, her decency, the very things Thomas had loved in her, would not allow it. She unbarred the door, a blast of Arctic air and snow swirling into the room, and peered out. Thaddeus was just finishing the last stretch of fence. He was a phantom in the blizzard, covered in a thick layer of snow, moving like a man possessed. He hammered the final wire into place, gave the post a hard shove to test its strength, and then seemed to sag the energy that had propelled him for hours, finally deserting him. He stumbled toward the barn, a hunched figure against the maelstrom. "Mr. Kane," Hannah shouted over the roar of the wind. "Thaddeus!" He stopped, turning slowly. He was barely visible through the thick snowfall. "You can't stay in the barn. You'll freeze to death. Come inside." She saw him hesitate. Even from a distance, she could feel his reluctance. To step inside her home was to cross a line he had been carefully observing all evening. It was a line of propriety, of distance. But the storm was making its own rules. He gave a slow nod and trudged toward the porch, stomping the thick cake of snow from his boots, before stepping into the relative warmth of the cabin. He removed his hat, revealing hair matted with sweat and melted snow. He stood just inside the door, dripping onto her wooden floor. looking profoundly out of place amidst the simple domestic tidiness of her home. The cabin, which had always felt small and cozy, suddenly seemed tiny with his presence in it. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I can take the floor by the fire. I won't impose." "Nonsense," she said, her voice firm. "You'll take the cot in the corner. It's not much, but it's warm." She pointed to a simple folding cot she kept for emergencies. "And don't you dare argue." For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Wouldn't dream of it." As he settled himself on the cot, stripping off his frozen duster and placing it near the hearth, an awkward but strangely comfortable silence fell between them. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howling rage of the storm outside. The cabin, which had felt like a prison of loneliness for months, now felt like a sanctuary, a fortress for two. "You never finished telling me," Hannah said quietly, ladling him another cup of coffee. "Why you know men like Croft so well." Thaddeus stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his pale eyes. He was quiet for a long time, and she thought he wouldn't answer. "Because I used to be one," he said, his voice low and full of a gravelly regret. "Not a rancher, something else. I worked for the railroad, a foreman, a company man." He took a sip of coffee. "In Wyoming. We were laying track through land that didn't belong to us, pushing people out, people with deeds and families, people like you." He spoke of a life that seemed a world away, a life of power and ambition. He'd had a wife then named Mary, and a young son, Daniel. He had believed in the company, in the grand narrative of progress and manifest destiny. He had followed orders, pushed men to their limits, and cleared the way for the iron horse, no matter the cost. There was a family. He continued, his voice barely a whisper. The Hudsons. They had a small farm right in the path of our survey line. Good people. They wouldn't sell. So the company sent men. Not men like me. Men like Abe Croft's foreman. Thugs. They were supposed to scare them off. His hands tightened around his cup. There was a fire. It got out of control. The farmhouse, the barn, everything. He fell silent, the muscle in his jaw working. Hannah felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "The Hudsons," she prompted gently. "They got out," he said, shaking his head. "But I saw it. I saw the fear in their eyes. The same fear I saw in yours tonight when Croft showed up. I saw my wife and my own boy in their faces. And I realized what I had become. A tool for men like that." "What did you do?" "I quit," he said simply. "Walked away from the money, the position, everything. Testified against the company man who gave the order. But he had money and lawyers. Nothing came of it. My wife, Mary. She couldn't look at me the same after that. She said the man she married wouldn't have stood by. She was right. She took our boy and went back east to her family. I haven't seen them in 3 years." He looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers. The regret in them was a raw, open wound. "So I started walking. I figured if I walked long enough, maybe I could walk away from the man I was. And maybe if I did enough good with these hands, it might balance out some of the bad." The story settled in the small cabin, as heavy and profound as the snow piling up outside. This wasn't a drifter without a past. This was a man shackled to one. A man on a pilgrimage of penance. Her image of him, the dangerous, rootless vagrant, dissolved, replaced by something far more complex and tragic. He wasn't running from the law. He was running from himself. Hannah felt her own walls, the ones she had so carefully constructed since Thomas's death, begin to crumble. She saw a kinship in their loneliness, in their shared experience of loss, albeit of a different kind. "My Thomas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He used to say that a man isn't defined by the mistakes he makes, but by what he does to fix them." She offered him a small, watery smile. "Looks like you fixed my fence real good, Mr. Kane." He looked at her, then at the sturdy wooden beam over the door, at the warm, safe cabin, and the storm raging outside. "Thaddeus," he corrected her softly. "My name is Thaddeus." In that moment, in the heart of the blizzard, something shifted between them. The formal titles of Ma'am and Mr. Kane melted away in the warmth of the fire. They were no longer a widow and a drifter. They were just Hannah and Thaddeus, two souls weathering the same storm, finding unexpected shelter in each other's company. But even as a fragile trust was being forged, a new, more sinister threat was taking shape. Miles away in the warmth of his opulent ranch house, Silas Croft was pouring himself a brandy. The defiance of the widow and her newfound protector had festered into a cold rage. This was no longer just about pasture land. It was about power. And he had just remembered a conversation from a month prior with a Pinkerton agent passing through town, asking questions about a former railroad foreman from Wyoming who'd made trouble for some very important people. A man named Thaddeus Kane. Croft smiled. The storm would give him the perfect cover. By the time it cleared, the drifter would be gone, the widow would be broken, and the valley would be his. The blizzard raged for 2 full days. The world was reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing. The cabin became an island in a sea of white, and Hannah and Thaddeus, its sole inhabitants, fell into a strange domestic rhythm. He was a man of quiet capability. He chopped firewood from the stack on the porch with an easy strength, tended the fire, and repaired a broken chair leg with a bit of wire and surprising finesse. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful. He asked about Thomas not with morbid curiosity, but with a gentle respect, and listened as she spoke of their dreams for the small homestead. In turn, she learned more about him, not from grand confessions, but from small remarks, how he knew the names of wildflowers his son Daniel had liked, or the way his wife Mary used to braid her hair. He was painting a portrait of a life he had lost, a life he was still mourning. The shotgun remained over the mantel, but the suspicion behind its presence had evaporated. Hannah found herself trusting him, a feeling so foreign it was almost disorienting. She was used to relying only on herself. Now the simple presence of another capable adult, a man who faced the world with a quiet solidity, eased a tension in her she hadn't realized she was carrying. The baby seemed to sense it, too, settling into a period of calm, gentle movement. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally died down. The silence was deafening. Sunlight, brilliant and blinding, streamed through the windows, reflecting off a landscape transformed. The world was buried under 4 feet of pure white snow, sculpted by the wind into magnificent rolling drifts. "Looks like the world got born again," Hannah whispered, looking out the window in awe. "It'll be a hard melt," Thaddeus said from behind her, his voice practical. "Creek's going to run high." He was already pulling on his boots. "I need to check the barn, make sure the roof held. See to your chickens." It was the "your chickens" that struck her. He wasn't a hired hand anymore. He had taken a share of her burdens onto his own shoulders. The day was spent digging out. They worked together, clearing a path from the cabin to the barn, then to the chicken coop, The work was hard, but in the bright sun and clean, cold air, it felt cleansing. They laughed when a drift of snow slid off the roof and buried Thaddeus up to his chest. It was a simple, honest sound, and Hannah realized she hadn't truly laughed since before Thomas's death. The sound felt good. It felt like life. The sense of peace was so profound that the knock on the door came as a violent intrusion. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was a hard, official rap of knuckles on wood. They exchanged a look. His was wary, guarded. Hers was pure fear. No one should be able to get through this snow, unless they were determined. "Stay back," Thaddeus murmured, moving to stand between her and the door. He didn't reach for a weapon, but he stood with his weight balanced ready. Hannah held her breath as he slid the bar back and opened the door a crack. 2 men stood there, their horses steaming behind them. They were bundled in heavy coats, their faces red from the cold. One was a man in his late 40s, with a drooping moustache and a silver star pinned to his coat. The other was Silas Croft. "Ma'am," the lawman said, tipping his hat. "Sheriff Brody from Livingston. Sorry to intrude, but we're looking for someone." "We're fine here, Sheriff," Hannah said, her voice strained. Sheriff Brody's eyes slid past Thaddeus and fixed on her. "This isn't a social call, ma'am. Mr. Croft here came to me with some interesting information about your hired man." His gaze sharpened, landing squarely on Thaddeus. "Says your name is Thaddeus Kane." "That's right," Thaddeus said, his voice calm. "Funny thing," the sheriff continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I got a wire a while back from the Pinkerton agency. They're looking for a Thaddeus Kane themselves. Seems he's a person of interest in a federal investigation. A railroad swindle down in Wyoming. They want to ask him some questions." Croft stood behind the sheriff, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. This was his checkmate. He hadn't needed to use his own thugs. He'd brought the law itself. "He's a witness," Croft added, his voice dripping with false concern. "A key witness, the Pinkerton said. Seems some very powerful men want to have a word with him. Men who don't like witnesses." He looked Thaddeus up and down. "A man like that, hiding out on a poor widow's homestead. Makes you wonder what he's really after, doesn't it, Sheriff?" Hannah's blood ran cold. It all clicked into place. The reason Thaddeus was drifting, the reason he kept to himself. He wasn't just running from his own guilt. He was being hunted. And Silas Croft, with his connections and his malice, had just painted a target on his back. "I'm not hiding," Thaddeus said, his eyes locked on the sheriff, ignoring Croft completely. "I testified. I told them everything I know. They chose not to press charges against the man responsible." "That's not what the wire says," Sheriff Brody said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "It says you're a material witness who disappeared. Says you're to be detained for your own protection and for further questioning. Now, are you going to come along peacefully, Mr. Kane?" This was the moment. The crossroads. Thaddeus could go with them, disappear into the custody of men who were likely paid by the very company he'd testified against. Or he could run. But where could he run to, in a world of snow? He looked over his shoulder at Hannah. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also something else, a flicker of defiance, a stubborn belief in the man he'd shown himself to be in the shelter of the storm, not the man Croft was painting him as. "He's not going anywhere," Hannah said, stepping forward so she stood beside Thaddeus. She placed a protective hand on her belly. "He works for me. He fixed my fence and he's helping me see through the winter. This is his home." The sheriff looked taken aback by her ferocity. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is official business. You are interfering with a federal inquiry. You're harboring a fugitive." "He's not a fugitive, he's a friend," she shot back. "And you're on my land. Silas Croft has been harassing me for months, and now he shows up with a tame sheriff and a convenient story. The moment the snow clears." "Doesn't that seem mighty suspicious to you, Sheriff? Or are you just another one of his hired hands, but with a badge?" Sheriff Brody's face hardened. "That's enough, Mrs. Miller. I'm warning you." "No," Thaddeus said, his voice low, but carrying an immense authority. He put a gentle hand on Hannah's arm, moving her behind him again. "She's right to be suspicious, Sheriff, but this isn't her fight." He looked Brody straight in the eye. "I'll go with you, peacefully, on one condition. I'm not in the business of making deals." Brody grunted. "You'll leave her be," Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a deadly serious pitch. "You and him." He shot a look at Croft that was pure ice. "You will guarantee her safety. You will guarantee that this man and his thugs stay away from her and her land. You give me your word as a man of the law." A tense silence hung in the frigid air. The sheriff looked from Thaddeus's unyielding face to Croft's smug one, then to Hannah's terrified but resolute expression. Something in the drifter's demand, in his willingness to trade his freedom for her safety, seemed to weigh on the lawman. Perhaps he wasn't as tame as Hannah had accused. "Fine," Brody finally bit out. "You have my word. No one will bother the lady." He looked at Croft. "That goes for you too, Silas. This is over." Croft's smirk faltered for a second, replaced by a flash of anger, but he quickly masked it. "Of course, Sheriff. I only ever wanted what was best for the community." "Good," Thaddeus said. He turned and looked at Hannah one last time. There was a world of unspoken words in that gaze, an apology, a thank you, a farewell. "Keep the fire lit, Hannah," he said softly. Then he turned and walked out the door into the blinding sun, flanked by the sheriff and his enemy. Hannah watched them go, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The sturdy fence Thaddeus had built seemed to mock her, a symbol of a safety that had just been stolen from her. The storm outside had passed, but the real storm had just broken, and it had swept away the one person who had made her feel safe. She was alone again, with nothing but a lawman's questionable promise to protect her from the wolf at her door. A profound and terrifying silence descended on the homestead, a silence made heavier by the thick blanket of snow that swallowed all sound. Hannah watched them ride away, 3 small, dark specks, shrinking against the vast, indifferent canvas of white, until they were consumed by it entirely. Thaddeus didn't look back. The finality of that simple act of him, facing forward toward an uncertain fate, sent a shard of ice into her heart. The sheriff's promise to protect her echoed in her ears, but the words were hollow, brittle things. It was the word of a man who had ridden up with her enemy. His authority borrowed and bent by Croft's influence, it was worth nothing. She spent the rest of the day entombed in a haze of dread. The cabin, which had so recently felt like a sanctuary, a fortress against the storm, now felt like a fragile core. She moved on autopilot, stoking the fire, checking on the chickens, her body performing the mundane tasks of survival, while her mind screamed. The shotgun Thomas's shotgun was once again her constant companion, resting against the wall on the table, always within arm's reach. Every creak of the house, settling under the weight of the snow, was the sound of a footstep on the porch. Every shadow thrown by the shifting sun seemed to hold the hulking, malevolent form of Croft's foreman, Abe. The fragile trust Thaddeus had built board by board, like the fence he'd mended, felt like a distant dreamlike memory, replaced by the stark, cold reality of her absolute vulnerability. Croft hadn't just removed a piece from the board. He'd taken her king, leaving her exposed and defenseless. And he knew it. He was a patient predator, and he thought he had already known. Ready. One. Night fell, not with the gentle grace of evening, but like a predator's cloak, bringing with it a deeper biting cold and an impenetrable darkness. Hannah sat by the fire, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, but the chill was inside her, a cold that no fire could touch. She didn't light the other lamps, preferring the single flickering light of the hearth, which left the corners of the room in deep shadow. She was listening for the sound that she knew with a bone-deep certainty was coming. Just after midnight, she heard it. It wasn't the sharp official knock of the law. It was something far more sinister. A soft, heavy crunch of boots in the packed snow, coming from the side of the cabin, the side without a window, the blind side. Her blood, which had been sluggish with dread, turned to ice. They hadn't even waited a full day. The sheriff's promise was a lie. A puff of frozen air dissipated in the wind. She wasn't just paranoid. She was prey. Her hand, slick with a sudden sweat, closed around the stock of the shotgun. She rose without a sound, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. Her hands trembled so violently, she feared she would drop the heavy weapon. She crept to the cabin wall, pressing her ear against the cold, rough-hewn logs. Muffled voices filtered through low and conspiratorial. She recognized the gravelly, cruel tone of Abe instantly. The other was a voice she didn't know, higher-pitched, nervous. "Just wants the drifter's satchel," Abe was saying, his voice a low rumble. "Croft thinks he's got proof in it, something to shut him up for good. We get it, we get paid. Then we persuade the widow to sell. A little scare is all it'll take now she's all alone." "And the fire?" the other voice asked, a tremor of unease in it. "Just a little one." Abe chuckled, a grim, humorless sound that made Hannah's skin crawl. "In the barn, to show we mean business. She sees that go up. She'll sign anything Croft puts in front of her. Now you take the back. Make sure she don't try to run. I'll go in the front." Hannah's mind, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly kicked into a frantic high gear. Burn her out. They were going to burn the barn Thomas had built, the place where Thaddeus had found shelter, and then they would come for her. And they were looking for Thaddeus's satchel. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room. It was sitting right there by the cot where he had slept, a simple, battered leather bag that held the key to everything. She looked at it then, at the heavy wooden bar on her door. It was thick, but it wouldn't hold for long against two determined men with pry bars and malice in their hearts. Then her gaze fell on the lantern Thaddeus had hung on a porch post, the one he'd worked by its metal frame, glinting in the faint moonlight. An idea desperate, dangerous, and utterly terrifying sparked in her mind. It was a plan born of her husband's practicality and her own fierce primal will to survive. She would not be a victim cowering in the dark. She would not let them take her home. If there was going to be a fire, she would be the one to light it. She moved with a speed she didn't know she possessed, a sudden surge of adrenaline overpowering her trembling. She snatched the satchel, its worn leather cool beneath her fingers. She grabbed the small canister of kerosene she kept for the lamps, her hands fumbling with the cap. With a sloshing sound that seemed deafening in the silence, she doused the satchel, the pungent smell filling the small cabin. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She moved to the hearth and with a shaking hand pulled a burning piece of kindling from the fire. The flame at its tip danced wildly, a tiny, furious star of defiance. She took a deep breath, slid the heavy bar on the door open with an agonizing, drawn-out creak, and stepped out onto the porch into the freezing night air. Abe was just rounding the corner, a crowbar held loosely in one hand. His face, illuminated by the cold moonlight reflecting off the snow, was a mask of brutal intent. His eyes widened in surprise as he saw her standing there, not cowering, but waiting. "Well now, little mother," he sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Decided to be neighborly. Saves me the trouble of breaking down your door." "I have something for Mr. Croft," she said, her voice shaking, but carrying a strange new strength. She held up the kerosene-soaked satchel. Before he could process her words or her actions, she touched the glowing tip of the kindling to the saturated leather. It went up with a sudden, violent whoosh, a ball of bright orange flame that erupted in her hands, the heat searing her face. "Tell him he can have it," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and powerful. And with a surge of strength fueled by fear and fury, she hurled the burning satchel not at Abe, but in a high, desperate arc over his head toward the dark, gaping maw of the hayloft in her barn. It sailed through the frigid air like a meteor, a comet of her own making. It landed squarely amongst the loose, dry hay. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The dry tinder ignited, and with a deafening roar, the entire barn exploded in a tower of flame that banished the night and lit up the entire valley in a brilliant, terrible orange. Abe stared momentarily, paralyzed in stunned disbelief, his face bathed in the roaring firelight. "You crazy?" He never finished the sentence. From the darkness at the edge of the woods, a figure emerged, a phantom moving with silent, lethal speed. It was Thaddeus. He hadn't fled. He must have doubled back, circled around, anticipating Croft's treachery. He slammed into Abe like a freight train, a whirlwind of righteous fury. There was no hesitation, no warning, just a single, powerful, bone-jarring blow to the jaw that sent the big man sprawling backward into a deep snowdrift, his head snapping back with a sickening crack. He lay still, out cold. The second man, seeing the barn become an inferno, and his partner drop as if struck by lightning, fired a wild, panicked shot into the air and fled into the darkness, crashing through the trees like a spooked deer. But the scene was not over. The night was now a tableau of chaos. As the barn burned, its timbers groaning and collapsing, casting wild, dancing shadows, two more riders galloped hard into the clearing drawn by the light. It was Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of incandescent fury, and behind him, a man in a dark city suit and a bowler hat, the Pinkerton Fields. "What in God's name is going on?" Brody roared, his voice barely audible over the crackle and roar of the flames. "It's exactly what I told you would happen." "Sheriff," Thaddeus yelled, standing over Abe's unconscious form, his chest heaving. "You take me away, and Croft sends his dogs to finish the job." The Pinkerton agent dismounted, with an agile grace, his sharp, intelligent eyes taking in the entire chaotic scene in a single sweeping glance. The burning barn, the downed thug, the defiant widow with soot on her face and fire in her eyes, and the supposed fugitive standing guard over her. "I think," Fields said, his voice crisp and authoritative, a stark contrast to the surrounding pandemonium, "that my agency and the law in this valley have been grievously misled." He walked over to Abe and nudged the unconscious man disdainfully with the toe of his polished boot. This is one of Croft's men, isn't he? He is, Hannah said, her voice still trembling with adrenaline but firm. They were going to burn us out. They said it themselves. At that moment, from Thaddeus's satchel, which had been thrown clear of the main blaze by the force of the explosion, and now lay smouldering at the edge of the firelight, a small leather-bound ledger book had fallen out. Its pages singed but intact. Field's sharp eyes spotted it. He walked over, picked it up, and brushed the snow from its cover. He opened it. Even in the flickering light of the fire, the neat columns of names, dates, and figures were clear. This, and Field said, his voice ringing with the thrill of discovery as his eyes scanned the pages, is the proof we were looking for. The real proof. The names of the railroad officials Croft was paying off, the shipment dates, the illegal land grabs. It's all here. He looked up, his gaze locking first with Thaddeus's, then with the sheriff's. He wasn't trying to silence a witness. He was trying to destroy the evidence against himself and his very powerful partners. Sheriff Brody stared from the incriminating ledger to the burning barn, then to the spot on the horizon where Silas Croft's ranch lay blissfully unaware of the reckoning that was coming. The expression on his face cycled through shock, dawning realization, and finally a deep and profound shame that quickly hardened into cold, righteous anger. He had been played for a fool. His honor, his badge, had been used as a weapon by a common criminal. Croft, Brody growled, the name a curse on his lips. His hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol, but this time it wasn't with the lazy confidence of a compromised lawman. It was with the firm, resolute grip of a man with a purpose. He's not going to get away with this. He looked at Thaddeus, a new grudging respect in his eyes. You were right, Kane. I was played. It won't happen again. An hour later, the barn was a smouldering skeletal ruin, hissing and spitting embers into the pre-dawn sky. Hannah sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the last of the embers glow against the snow-covered ground. Thaddeus sat beside her. The silence between them was no longer awkward or fragile, but deep and comforting, a shared space carved out of the chaos. Sheriff Brody and the Pinkerton agent had returned. As promised, they had ridden hard to the Bar C Ranch and had arrested Silas Croft in his bed, along with his foreman, who had regained consciousness with a splitting headache and a newfound fear of drifters. Croft's reign over the valley, built on fear and corruption, was over. The ledger was the final nail in his coffin. The agent Fields, Thaddeus said quietly, into the stillness, his voice rough. He's cleared my name, officially. Sent a wire to my wife's family in Ohio. Told them what really happened about Croft and the railroad men. Told them the danger is past. He paused, the silence stretching as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern peaks. He said, I'm free to go. Hannah's heart, which had been slowly regaining its normal rhythm, clenched painfully. Free to go. Of course he was. Back to his wife Mary. Back to his son Daniel. Back to the life he had lost, the life he had mourned in the quiet moments by her fire. It was what he deserved. It was the right and proper thing. But the thought of the profound silence returning to the homestead, the thought of facing the future truly alone, was an ache so deep it was almost unbearable. You should, she said, her voice a little too quiet, her eyes fixed on the glowing ruins. They're your family. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and she felt his gaze on her. She finally turned to meet it. His pale blue eyes, a reflection of the winter sky, were searching her face in the soft grey light of the new day. Mary, she's a good woman, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years of regret. But what we had, it was broken long before I started walking. cracked right down the middle by the man I used to be. Maybe some things can't be fixed. Maybe some fences are just too far gone to ever be mended. He looked away from her, out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to crest the snow-covered peaks, setting the sky ablaze with strokes of pink and gold. This place, this storm, you? He struggled for the words, a man unaccustomed to bearing his soul. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from something. I was fighting for something. For a piece of land. For a good woman and her unborn child. He turned back to her, and his gaze was steady and clear, all the old ghosts seemingly banished by the night's fire and the morning's light. "I can't replace Thomas," he said softly, his voice full of respect. "I wouldn't ever try. But a woman alone can't run a homestead through a Montana winter. And a boy needs a man to teach him things. How to set a post, how to read the sky." He looked down at his own calloused hands. And a man needs a reason to stop drifting. He needs a place to build. Hannah looked at those hands that had built her a fence, that had held a coffee cup in her kitchen, that had fought for her in the firelight. She looked at the smouldering ruins of her barn and felt not loss, but a strange and profound sense of cleansing. It was the end of one life, the life of a frightened, lonely widow, and it was the beginning of another. She felt a strong, sudden kick from within her belly, a powerful, insistent movement that seemed to affirm his words. A true, radiant smile bloomed on her face, a smile that reached her eyes and erased the last traces of fear and soot from her expression. "The baby's hungry," she said, her voice clear and strong in the morning air. "And the man of the house is going to need his strength." She looked from the ruins to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of relief and hope. "There's a barn to rebuild." It wasn't a promise of love, not yet. It was something more solid, more real, more vital. It was a partnership, an alliance forged in a storm and tested by fire. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the valley in a clean, hopeful golden light, Hannah Miller and Thaddeus Kane sat together no longer. A widow and a drifter, but the foundation of a new family ready to face the sunrise and ready to build their future, one post at a time. If this story of how a single act of kindness, a mended fence, could unravel a conspiracy and forge a new family in the heart of a merciless frontier resonated with you then, please help us share it. The Wild West was built not just by gunslingers and cattle barons, but by the quiet courage of everyday people like Hannah and the hard-won redemption of men like Thaddeus. Theirs is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest strength is found in sheltering another soul from the storm. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances. Share this video with someone who loves a story of true grit and unexpected hope. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. We have so many more stories from the forgotten corners of history to share with you, tales of courage, survival, and the enduring power of the human heart. Thank you for listening.